They
Take this
told
for
her
her
she was
schooling. She
useless. The
deserves
morning
better
they
than their
traded her
cruelty.
away, the word flung carelessly like mud, sticking to her heart with a sting she had learned not to show. Her father wouldn't meet her gaze. Her mother folded her arms as if protecting herself from the shame of having birthed a daughter who brought nothing but trouble. And within minutes, a traveling trader was handed a few coins and a girl who didn't know whether to run or collapse, her knees shaking so hard the ground seemed uncertain beneath her. She had spent years trying to earn a place in that house, cooking before dawn, mending clothes until her fingers bled, lowering her voice until it nearly disappeared, shrinking herself into corners to avoid blame. But nothing ever softened their coldness. She existed to serve. And even then, she was never enough. When the trader told her she'd be taken north to a man needing help, she didn't ask questions. She simply clutched the tiny cloth bag her mother shoved into her hands. Though it held nothing of value except a single frayed ribbon, she kept out of stubborn sentimentality. Her journey was long and bitterly cold, the wagon wheels crunching through frostbitten forests where sunlight barely touched the ground. Each mile stole a little more of her breath, not from fear alone but from the crushing belief that perhaps her parents had spoken truth. Perhaps she really was worth so little. But everything changed the moment the wagon stopped in a remote clearing, and she saw him. A towering lumberjack, with shoulders broad enough to carry whole trees, yet eyes soft with exhaustion, standing in front of a crooked cabin with 4 children wrapped around his legs like roots, tying him to the earth. His flannel shirt was torn at the sleeve, his beard wind-tangled, and his posture sagged under burdens far heavier than wood. This was not a man seeking a servant or a bride or a purchase. This was a man fighting to keep his family afloat in a world that never paused for grief. The trader spoke to him briskly, as though exchanging tools rather than human lives, but Elias Thorne said nothing at first. He simply glanced at the girl, really looked at her, as though he recognized a familiar kind of hurt tucked behind her lowered gaze. The children peeked out from behind him with wide, curious eyes, one sucking her thumb, one clutching a wooden toy horse, one blinking sleepily, and one hiding altogether. Something inside the girl loosened at the sight of them, a softness she didn't know she still possessed. And when Elias finally nodded and murmured, "You can stay until you find where you need to go," his voice was quiet, steady, carrying neither ownership nor commanderly welcome. In that moment, standing on frozen ground with her past behind her and 4 small faces staring up at her with cautious hope, she felt the first fragile flicker of possibility. Maybe she wasn't useless after all. The cabin creaked like an old man sighing, its roof patched with mismatched shingles. Its porch slanted just enough to make her wonder how many winters it had survived. But the moment she stepped inside, she understood more about this family than words could have told her. The air smelled faintly of pine and porridge. Children's drawings were pinned crookedly to the walls, and a pair of tiny boots sat by the door, mud still clinging to the soles, as if their owner had run in half laughing, half crying only an hour earlier. Elias watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, as though trying to determine whether she would bolt back into the snow, and she stood with her hands clasped, unsure whether to breathe deeply or hold her breath altogether. The children hovered nearby, not afraid, not bold, just cautious, like small animals who had learned to measure new people before trusting them. The eldest, about 12, stepped forward with the quiet pride of someone forced to grow up too quickly, and said, "I'm Rowan. I help Papa." His siblings introduced themselves in shy murmurs, little May with her tangled curls, Finn with his missing front tooth, and baby Uni, who clung to her father's leg as though it were the last safe place in the world. Their clothes were patched, their cheeks smudged with soot, their gazes weighted with something heavier than childhood should allow, and the girl felt her heart twist, recognizing the familiar hollowness of loss in all of them. Elias cleared his throat and gestured toward the small kitchen table, speaking with a softness she didn't expect from a man who could split logs in a single swing. "Sit. You've come a long way." He ladled thin stew into chipped bowls, his movements careful, almost apologetic, as though embarrassed by how little he had to offer. She shook her head instinctively, insisting the children eat first, and something flickered across Elias's face, a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Or maybe relief, as though her kindness eased some worry he had been carrying alone. As they ate, the cabin filled with a warmth, not from the crackling fire but from the quiet sounds of a family existing. May humming between spoonfuls, Finn tapping his heel under the bench, Rohan watching everything with the protective gaze of someone twice his age. No one asked her where she came from or why she had arrived, wrapped in the ache of unwantedness. They simply accepted her presence like another log placed gently on the fire. When the meal ended, Elias showed her the small corner where she could sleep, a low cot with a wool blanket worn thin. At the edge, a sand murmured, "It's not much, but no one will harm you here." His voice broke on that last word, and the girl looked up sharply, realizing he was speaking not just from courtesy, but from experience. The cabin might have been battered by storms, but it held something her old home never had: tenderness woven into the cracks, sorrow stitched into the beams, and the promise, quiet, trembling, but real, that she might finally be safe. You say. Morning came early in the mountains, with pale sunlight slipping through the warped shutters and the steady rhythm of Elias chopping wood outside, each strike echoing through the cold air like a heartbeat anchoring the cabin to the earth. She woke before the children, her breath rising in faint clouds, and instinctively began tidying, straightening blankets, sweeping ash from the hearth, folding the scattered little socks left by tiny feet the night before, movements so familiar they felt stitched into her bones. Back in her old home, chores had been demanded of her, proof she was worth the food on her plate. Here no one asked, yet her hands moved anyway, not from fear but from a quiet wish to ease the burdens pressing down on a man who seemed to carry the weight of two lives. When Elias stepped inside, his beard dusted with frost and his flannel shirt damp from early labor, he paused mid-stride at the sight of her busying herself. "You don't have to do all that," he said, voice rough but gentle, clearly unused to someone meeting him halfway. She looked up, self-conscious, but before she could apologize, May padded into the room, rubbing her eyes, whispering, "Papa." She made the room pretty, as though it were the most magical thing she'd ever witnessed. Finn darted in after her, already chattering about a wooden horse he'd carved that lost its tail, and Rohan followed more slowly, studying the girl with a guarded curiosity, as though unsure how long she planned to stay, or if she'd leave like their mother had, vanishing into the woods one fog-heavy morning and never returning. Elias' gaze lingered on Rohan for a beat too long, the unspoken history between them heavy as stone. The girl sensed their fragility, the way every routine felt like patchwork, stitched together from necessity rather than joy, and something inside her softened, realizing she had stepped into a home still learning how to breathe after heartbreak. She began helping, in small ways, stirring the morning porridge, brushing Uni's hair into two messy braids, mending Finn's torn sleeve, while he sat beside her humming off-key. Each act felt like pouring water onto parched soil, tentative and hopeful. Elias watched her with cautious gratitude, as though afraid she might vanish if he thanked her too openly. Yet sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes warmed in a way that made her chest tighten. By midday, the children hovered near her naturally, following her to the creek, tugging at her skirt, offering her little treasures: a smooth stone, a pinnacle, a wilted flower, tokens of trust she accepted with trembling hands. And when Rohan finally approached her, holding out a wooden spoon he had carved for her because everyone in the house should have their own, something inside her cracked open. She realized this place didn't simply shelter her, it needed her. And for the first time in her life, being needed didn't feel like a burden. It felt like belonging. As days folded into one another with the slow rhythm of mountain life, she began noticing the quieter truths about Eliasta, once hidden beneath the broad shoulders and steady hands. He rose before dawn, not out of habit, but because sleep rarely stayed with him. She often found him outside in the half-dark, staring into the trees as if expecting someone to walk out of them. When he thought no one watched, he rubbed his thumb over a small wooden pendant hanging from a leather cord worn smooth, clearly touched 1,000 times. Yet he never spoke of it, and she never asked. The children sensed it too. Whenever he froze in those silent, haunted moments, Rohan would take the younger ones aside, distracting them with games, so they wouldn't see the grief that still shadowed their father's eyes. She felt helpless watching him carry pain so quietly, a weight he seemed determined to shoulder alone. One evening, as she swept the floor and the children doodled with charcoal near the hearth, a sudden crash outside made Uni burst into tears and cling to her skirt. Elias was already at the door, nostrils flared, hand gripping the axe the way a man grips his last defense. It was only a fallen branch, nothing more, but he stayed tense long after, shoulders locked, breath sharp and uneven. She followed him outside, heart pounding not from fear but from the helpless ache of wanting to ease a sorrow she did not yet understand. The sky was turning the pale pink of a fading winter sunset when she found him sitting on the chopping block, elbows on his knees, head bowed. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. Still, when he lifted his gaze, she saw something raw flicker. There's something vulnerable enough to make her own breath catch. They get scared when you do, she said softly, not accusing, only offering understanding. Ilyas exhaled, a long weary sound. I know, I try. God, I try. His voice rasped, like a man unused to speaking about the battlefield inside him. She sat beside him without touching, close enough to be steadying, far enough not to crowd him. You're doing everything you can, she murmured. Honestly, because she had watched him pour himself into these children, into this home, until he was empty at nightfall. He shook his head. Their mother. She left without a word. One morning she was here. Next morning she wasn't. Every sound outside, every crack in the woods, I think. His voice broke. I think it's her coming back for them, or not coming back at all. The wind carried his words into the quiet trees, and she felt them settle deep inside her. She wanted to reach for his hand, to offer comfort more tangible than words. But instead she whispered, "You don't have to face that alone." Elias looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression changed, softened, opened just a fraction. In that fragile twilight moment, she felt the first shift between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust, slow and tender, beginning to root itself in the spaces where both of them had been broken. You said. The cabin grew brighter as winter loosened its grip, and with each passing day she felt herself weaving into the family more naturally, almost without noticing. She found her rhythm in the small things, braiding May's hair while the little girl talked endlessly about squirrels, wiping Finn's muddy hands before supper, steadying Uni on her first wobbly steps across the kitchen floor, and though none of these tasks were asked of her, they filled her with a strange, fragile warmth she didn't quite know how to hold. But it was Rohan who surprised her most. The quiet, watchful boy who once kept his distance now began leaving small carved trinkets on her Kotani wolves. A bird with uneven wings, a button-sized burnever, admitting they were his, but meeting her grateful smile with the shy lift of his chin that said he cared. Slowly, the invisible walls she'd carried since childhood began to crumble. She laughed more easily, breathed more deeply, and sometimes caught herself singing under her breath while stirring stew, startling at the sound of her own happiness. Elias noticed, he noticed everything, and, though he never spoke of it, she saw the way his eyes softened when he watched her kneel to tie Fin's bootlace or sway Uni to sleep against her shoulder. One late afternoon, after a day spent gathering, kindling with the children, she returned to the cabin to find Elias repairing the crooked porch step, his brow furrowed in concentration, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. When he glanced up at her, something unspoken flickered between them, an understanding so quiet it barely stirred the air. She knelt beside him without thinking, and held the board steady as he hammered, the rhythmic thud echoing in her chest. "You don't need to help with everything," he said, though his voice held no real protest. "I want to," she replied before she could stop the truth from slipping out. Elias paused mid-swing, the hammer trembling slightly in his grip. For a moment he looked at her, not with gratitude, but with something deeper, something like awe, or perhaps fear of what kindness might mean after so much loss. But then Finn called from inside, and the moment flitted away like a bird startled from a branch. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep in a heap of blankets and soft snores, Elias lingered by the doorway while she folded laundry by the fire. The room glowed in amber light, shadows dancing on the log walls, and she felt the warmth of the flames soak into her bones. "You've brought quiet," he murmured finally, as though speaking to the floorboards, to the fire, to anything except her eyes. "The kind we haven't had in a long time." She swallowed hard, emotion rising like a tide she wasn't ready for. Because the truth was simple and terrifying. This was the first place she'd ever felt useful without being used. The first home where her presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. And as she looked at Elias standing there, framed by firelight, weary and gentle and deeply human, her chest filled with a dawning certainty, she was not just surviving here. She was becoming someone new. Someone valued, someone seen, Spring winds arrived with a sharpness that reminded her of the past she thought she had finally outrun. And it struck without warning one afternoon while she hung laundry behind the cabin, sunlight warm on her arms, and the children laughing as they chased each other through the tall grass. A distant rumble wagon wheels grinding over stone made her freeze, the clothespin dropping from her fingers as a chill rushed up her spine. She knew that sound, knew it the way a hunted creature knows the snap of a twig. When she turned and saw the trader's wagon approaching through the trees, her throat closed, and every part of her screamed to run. Images of her parents' cold eyes, the trader's rough voice, the shame of being sold like livestock, everything she had buried surged forward with brutal force. Rohan noticed her panic first. He stepped in front of the younger children instinctively, his hand reaching for hers. "What's wrong?" he asked, but she couldn't answer. The wagon creaked to a stop, and the trader climbed down with the smugness of a man who believed he still had claim over her. "There you are, girl," he called, voice oily and loud enough to echo across the clearing. "Your parents want you back. Turns out, they changed their minds. They'll pay for the return trip." The lie hit her like a slap. Her parents would never change their minds, they simply wanted more coin, more gain. Her knees trembled, but before she could speak, before she could even take a breath, Elias appeared at the cabin door, his eyes narrowing with a protective sharpness she had never witnessed in him. He strode toward them with steps heavy enough to shake the earth. "She's not going anywhere," Elias said, voice low and steady, but filled with a dangerous calm that made the trader falter. "I made a deal," the trader insisted. "Not with her," Elias cut in, "and not with me." Rohan moved closer to her, his small hand gripping hers tightly, grounding her in place. The trader scoffed and grabbed her arm as if she was still his property. But Elias was on him in an instant, pulling the man's hand away with a force that left no room for argument. "Touch her again," Elias warned, "and you'll lose that hand." The air went silent, so silent even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The trader stepped back, realizing this was not the broken, grieving father he had underestimated, but a man who had found something worth protecting. "She's nothing." The trader spat, but the words barely left his mouth before Elias responded with a quiet fierceness that made her chest tighten. "She's worth more than you'll ever understand." Shame and fury twisted the trader's face, but he climbed back into his wagon, muttering curses as the wheels clattered away through the trees. Only when the sound faded did her breath finally release in a shaky gasp. Elias turned to her then, his expression softening, concern overtaking anger. "You're safe," he said gently. "As long as I'm here, you're safe." And with the children pressed around her and Elias standing like an unshakable wall at her side, she felt something break open inside her, not fear this time, but an overwhelming sense of being defended, cherished, chosen. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. You said. That night, the cabin felt different. Not because the furniture had shifted, or the fire burned brighter, but because something inside her had quietly, irrevocably changed. She moved through the small home with trembling hands, folding blankets, checking the children's breathing, touching Eunice's cheek, as if to reassure herself that the world outside could no longer take her away. Elias lingered near the doorway, leaning one shoulder against the frame, watching her with an expression she didn't quite understand. Not pity, not gratitude, something deeper, something that made her pulse flutter with both fear and longing. When she finally sat by the fire, exhausted from the storm of emotion the day had forced upon her, he approached slowly, like a man afraid to spook a wild creature. "You were frightened," he sighed softly, sitting across from her but close enough that their knees almost touched. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. "I'm not surprised. You've lived through things no one should endure." She swallowed hard, staring at her hands. "They said I was worthless," she whispered, "that no man would ever want me, that I wasn't fit for a family." Elias' jaw tightened, not in anger at her, but at the past that had carved such wounds into her. "They were wrong," he said quietly, fiercely, "so wrong it's a wonder they dare speak at all." Tears welled before she could stop them, and she turned her face away, ashamed of her weakness. But Elias reached out, slowly she had time to pull back, if she wished, and touched her wrist with gentle, calloused fingers. "You are not useless," he murmured. "I see how the children cling to you, how the house feels lighter since you arrived, how you breathed life into a place that was starting to dim." His thumb brushed her skin, sending warmth spiraling up her arm. "You matter here, To them, to me. Her breath hitched because she felt it too. The way her heart steadied when he entered a room. The way her hand stilled when she heard his voice. The way she stepped closer without meaning to. The fire crackled softly beside them, casting shadows that danced across his face, softening the rugged lines etched by grief and labor. For a moment, they simply existed in the quiet, two people who had learned to survive pain, now learning, slowly, what it meant to feel safe. Ilya's voice broke the silence again, low and tentative. I don't know what future you want. I don't want to decide it for you. But if you choose to stay, not out of need or fear, but choice. He paused, breath trembling. I would be grateful, more than you know. Her heart thudded at the weight of his words, at the sincerity wrapped in them. And as she looked at him, the strong, tender man who had defended her, welcomed her, respected her, she felt the world tilt gently, settling into a place that felt like truth. She didn't answer right away, but her hand turning in his, fingers curling around his slowly, gently, was enough. For him, for her, for the fragile beginning of something she scarcely dared to name. The next morning dawned with a soft cold glow, the kind that slipped gently across the mountains as if blessing whatever it touched, and when she opened her eyes, the first thing she felt was the unfamiliar, but steady sense of peace resting in her chest. The children were already stirring, May humming, while she braided her own hair. Finn trying to wrestle his boots on the wrong feet again. Uni toddling from cat to cat, in search of a warm lapand. Rohan stood by the door, watching her the way only he did. Quiet, perceptive, hopeful. When she rose, Rohan stepped forward and held out a wooden carving he must have worked on in secret. A small figure of a woman standing beside 4 tiny children, the wood smooth and polished though the shapes were simple. It's us, he said shyly, eyes flicking up to meet hers. If you stay. Emotion rushed through her so fiercely she had to hold the back of a chair to steady herself. No one had ever carved her into anything, let alone a family. Before she could respond, Elias appeared in the doorway, freshly returned from chopping morning firewood, breath fogging in the cool air. He froze when he saw Rohan's gift in her hands, something fragile and hopeful flickering across his face. For a moment, the room felt suspended, no past, no fear, just possibility. She looked at Elias then, really looked, the gentle strength in his shoulders, the quiet tenderness in his eyes, the way he stood as though prepared to step aside if she wanted to walk away. And in that instant, she understood. She had spent her whole life waiting for someone to choose her, never realizing that the choice she needed most to make was her own. With trembling breath, she crossed the room to him. I want to stay, she whispered, voice barely more than air, but steady with truth. Elias inhaled sharply, as if her words had struck him somewhere deep. Because you feel you must, he asked softly. Or because you want to. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to see the fear behind his question, and placed a hand over her heart. Because here, with you, with them, I feel whole. I want this. I choose this. He didn't move for a moment, almost disbelieving. And then relief broke across his face like the first thaw of spring. His hand rose slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with reverence, as though touching something sacred. The children swarmed them, then May hugging her waist, Finn shouting, she's staying. Papa, she is really staying. And Rohan simply leaned against her side, silent but smiling in a way she'd never seen. Elias drew her close, not with urgency, but with a quiet, grateful certainty. And for the first time in her life she felt what it meant to belong, not by force or desperation, but by choice. The cabin around them, worn and weathered, suddenly felt like the safest place in the world, and as the morning light gathered round their little family, she understood. She had not been saved. She had been found, and she had finally found them too.